He placed the earring on the table between them, as if it were evidence. It was a garnet drop, small and darkly red, set in old gold with an irregular stone that caught the morning light from Lady Halford's drawing-room window. Cecily had not seen it in 3 months. She had told herself, on her worst evenings, that she had imagined the loss, that the earring was still tucked inside the corner seam of her reticule, where she had placed it at midnight for safekeeping and simply failed to find it with her fingers. The telling of this small untruth had gotten her through November and into December, and she was fairly practiced at it now. There was the earring on Lady Halford's writing table, and there was the Duke of Muirfield standing across from her with his hands at his back, and there was Lady Constance Muirfield behind him near the door, watching with her pale blue eyes and her ivory fan closed tight in her hand. "It came to my attention through my jeweler," the Duke said. His voice was even, unhurried, as though he were reading aloud from a document that required no particular emphasis. "The piece is documented. A matched pair, Georgian, garnet, and old gold, registered to the estate of Sir William Vane in a letter of 1802. You are, I believe, Sir William's daughter," Cecily said. "I am." She did not touch the earring. Her hands, gloved in their white cotton, were folded at her waist, and she kept them there by a deliberate act of will. "Then it is yours," the Duke said. "I have come to return it." He looked at her with gray eyes that gave away nothing at all. Then he said, with the same quiet evenness, "I should like to know, Miss Vane, where you have hidden the pair." There was a small silence. Lady Constance's fan did not open. Lady Halford's canary went on singing its particular song in its cage by the window, indifferent to the nature of the moment. Cecily thought, He knows exactly where I was that night, and he knows exactly what the earring's presence in his library at midnight signifies. He has come not to restore what is mine, but to ask what I cannot safely answer in front of his aunt." She said, "Your Grace is very kind to return it." She picked up the earring. She felt the familiar weight of the old gold setting against her palm, and for one moment the body's grief was larger than she could manage. Then she pressed it shut inside her glove, and she did not let that show on her face, and she thanked the Duke in the formal register, appropriate to a woman of her present station. Lady Constance said nothing. As the Duke turned to leave and Cecily moved to follow Lady Halford toward the breakfast room, she heard the older woman speak in a voice pitched exactly low enough to reach one person and no further. "The companion," Lady Constance said to no one in particular, "takes certain liberties." It was the first time Cecily had heard that particular arrangement of words used for her. It would not be the last. She had been the companion for 8 months. The position had come through a solicitor named Mr. Ferris, who had known her father and who had found Lady Halford's advertisement and written to Cecily at her cousin's house in Shropshire, where she was staying on the mutual understanding that neither party could bear the arrangement much longer. Lady Halford was 81 and rich and particular and given to ill health that required attendance without requiring anything that a trained medical person would recognize as care. She needed someone well-bred enough to accompany her to dinners without embarrassing her, educated enough to read aloud without stumbling, and meek enough to be corrected on points of conduct without argument. She had had 6 companions in 4 years. She told Cecily this on the afternoon of Cecily's arrival, in a tone that suggested the information was a warning rather than a history. Cecily had smiled and said, "I shall endeavor to be a credit to the position, my lady," and had meant it, and the 8 months had passed with a certain minimal decency, if not with anything approaching comfort. What Lady Halford did not know, because it was not her business, and because Cecily had been careful, was that the pair of earrings she sometimes glimpsed at Cecily's collar, worn on the occasions of greater formality, was in fact only one earring, transformed by a small modification of its hook into a mourning pin. Its twin had gone to a shop in Hanover Street 3 months before Cecily's arrival in London. The broker had given her £4 for it, which had been both insulting and necessary. She had kept the receipt. She had the figure in a small leather notebook. She was adding to her savings at the rate of £1.06 a month from her wages, and it would be, she had calculated, 11 more months before she had sufficient to redeem what she had pawned. The earrings had been her mother's. There was nothing else left of her mother's life in Cecily's possession. That fact had a weight she did not think about directly, as one does not look at a fire directly to see how large it is. The midsummer ball at Muirfield House had not been her idea. Lady Halford had been invited in her capacity as the godmother of one of the young women being introduced, and she had not the constitution to manage an evening of that length without assistance. Cecily had dressed carefully and done her hair, and attended as the occasion required, which meant remaining at Lady Halford's right hand through the early hours of the evening, and becoming invisible when Lady Halford was settled with her particular friends. She had been invisible extremely well until approximately midnight, when a sudden fierce desire to be alone for 5 minutes, just 5, just the span of a room without another person's needs pressing into her, had driven her through a door she had not been supposed to open, into a library that had been quiet and dark, and smelled of leather and cold ash. And she had sat down in a chair by the unlit fireplace and breathed, and the earring had slipped from the lining of her reticule without her hearing it go. She had discovered the loss the next morning and told herself the story about the corner seam. She was, as previously noted, fairly practiced at that particular untruth by the time the Duke of Muirfield placed the evidence on Lady Halford's writing table. If you have ever held something in your mind at a distance because looking at it directly would make it too large to bear, you may understand something of what drove Cecily through that library door. Stay a little longer, and you will understand something of what the Duke had begun to notice. He was not a man who noticed things easily. He was a man who accounted for them. These are not the same quality, and he had occasionally been told as much, though rarely by anyone who did not immediately regret saying it. He managed his estates, his parliamentary obligations, and his household with a precision that left nothing unaccounted for, and very little room for anything that had not been anticipated. His aunt said he had grown cold. His steward said he had grown careful. Neither was quite right, but neither was precisely wrong, and the distinction seemed to matter only to the Duke himself. He had found the earring at 7 in the morning, after the last of the servants had completed the clearing of the ground floor. He had carried it to his jeweler within the week. He had received the documentation within the fortnight. He had then done nothing for a further 6 weeks, which was not inattention, but accumulation. The garden party at Lord Hartley's house on the second Saturday of the new year was an obligation his aunt had accepted on his behalf. Cecily was there with Lady Halford, in her grey gown and her white gloves, managing a lap rug and a cup of tea, and the old woman's commentary on the clothing of every person within eyeshot. The Duke arrived late, which he always did at events he had not arranged himself, and he went first to speak with Lord Hartley. And then he walked across the frost-stiff lawn to where Lady Halford was situated in a chair near the box hedge. He did not come to speak with Lady Halford immediately. He stood some distance away with Lord Hartley, and Cecily was not looking at him, or not looking at him in a way she would have acknowledged, when Lady Halford had a small crisis. It was the kind of small crisis that had no drama, and required everything. The lap rug slipped, and the tea tipped, and the cup went into Lady Halford's skirts, and the old woman made a sound of distress that drew the nearest guests toward her with the collective attention of people uncertain whether they are witnessing an inconvenience or a medical event. Cecily moved before anyone else moved. She had the rug and the empty cup and Lady Halford's hands, and she said something quiet to the guests that sent them back to their conversations, and she had Lady Halford dry and resettled, and the evidence removed, and the old woman's dignity restored in the space of perhaps 4 minutes, working without fuss and without calling for help, because none was required. She did not notice the Duke had been watching until she turned and found him standing at the edge of the lawn, still in the company of Lord Hartley, but not attending to Lord Hartley in the least. He was watching her with an expression she could not read at the distance. When she met his eyes, he did not look away, which was not what she expected. He said something to Lord Hartley briefly, and came across the frost-stiff lawn to where Lady Halford was situated in a chair near the box hedge. He said something to Lady Halford that made her laugh, which was not a sound Cecily had heard frequently. Then he turned, without any particular deliberateness, to Cecily, and said, "Miss Vane, are you cold?" It was the sort of question that seemed entirely ordinary. It was not. Lady Halford did not notice the distinction. Lady Constance, who had arrived behind the Duke and positioned herself near the garden gate with Miss Philippa Whitmore at her side, did notice it, and her thin mouth compressed by perhaps 2 millimeters. Cecily said she was not cold. The Duke said the morning was sharp. She agreed that it was. He glanced at the brooch at her collar, which was the garnet earring made into a pin, and she felt the warmth rise in her face before she could prevent it, and his gaze moved on as though he had not seen what he had unmistakably seen. That was the first proximity. She catalogued it later in her mind with the precision of someone who could not afford to lose her footing. 2 days after that, she was crossing the square on an errand for Lady Halford when she heard her name in his voice. She turned and found him at the curb outside a solicitor's office, hat in hand, the cold January air moving through his dark hair. He said, "My library. Monday morning, if you will. I have a matter to discuss." He said it the way a man says a thing when he has decided upon it, rather than the way a man says a thing when he is uncertain of the reception. And she said, "Yes, Your Grace," and walked on. And her heartbeat was not entirely regulated for the remainder of the errand. The library was warmer than she had expected. There was a fire laid and burning, which had not been the case at midnight on the night of the ball. And the winter light came through the tall windows onto a desk covered with papers and a small round table on which there was a tea tray. She had not thought there would be a tea tray. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, and he turned, and the quality of the morning light on his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. There was something tired in him, or something held for a long time under tension, and she saw it clearly for one moment, before his features settled into their customary order. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He did not. "You were in this room," he said, "on the night of the ball. It was not a question." "I was," Cecily said. "I should not have been, and I am aware of that." "The door was not locked." "No." He was quiet for a moment. He moved to the mantelpiece and looked down at the fire. His right hand went briefly to the breast pocket of his coat, a small gesture she did not yet have the history to read, and then was still again. "My jeweler tells me the earring is part of a set registered to your family, your father's estate." "My mother's, originally," Cecily said, and then wished she had not offered that, because it was information he had not asked for, and it made the earring more, not less, significant in the telling. He turned from the fire and looked at her directly with those gray eyes that sat under straight brows and gave away very little. "Where is the other?" he said. She had prepared a careful answer to this question during the walk from Lady Halford's house. She gave it now, steadily. "The other is in my possession, Your Grace. The piece in my reticule was intended to be compared against a description held by a jewelry establishment in Hanover Street. I am engaged in reclaiming the pair. A brief silence. You sold one, he said. I required the funds. At what price? She had not expected that question, and she was aware that something in her face changed in response to it. She said, £4. He said nothing. His expression was not pity, which she would have found insupportable. It was closer to the face of a man recording a figure that he will not forget. Your mother's earrings, he said, not as a question this time. Yes, he said. What is still outstanding on the redemption? She had the figure. She had always the figure, kept current, revised on the 1st of each month. She gave it to him, and he nodded, and she said quickly, I do not require assistance, Your Grace. I mention it only to answer your question completely. His head turned toward the west wall of the library, where a door stood half open onto a gallery she had noticed the night of the ball, but not entered. She could see, even from where she sat, that the far end of the gallery held a painting turned to face the plaster, its back presented to the room. She did not ask about it. She looked back at him. He said, You will tell me if you find the price has risen. It was not a question. It was not a command exactly either, though it was spoken with the grammar of one. She said, Yes, Your Grace, which was not precisely true, and was the most she could honestly offer. She left 20 minutes later with the first earring in her glove and a sensation in her chest that was not gratitude and was not hope, both of which would have been bearable, but was something older and more obstinate than either. If there is a quality you have learned to distrust, it is the quality of being attended to by someone whose attention carries weight. Stay a little longer. The months that followed were patient months. He did not rush. He was not, as far as Cecily could determine, constituted for rushing. He appeared at events she attended with Lady Halford, and when he was in the same room he found his way, by means that appeared incidental, and were not to a position from which he could hear her speak. He asked her questions about her reading. He asked on one occasion whether she had an opinion on the matter being debated in Lord Hartley's dining room, and she had given it, and he had listened with a quality of attention that made the old woman seated next to her glance over twice. Lady Constance watched all of this and said nothing to Cecily, and a great deal to others. At the Averley Musicale, Cecily was standing near the refreshment table when she heard Mrs. Whitmore, mother to Miss Philippa, say to a woman she did not know, "It is quite something that the companion attaches herself so persistently. One does not expect it, with girls of that class." Cecily kept her hand still on her glass. She did not turn. She heard the particular silence that falls when someone nearby has heard a thing that was intended to carry precisely as far as it did. Lady Constance, who was on the other side of the table, said nothing. Miss Philippa Whitmore was not unpleasant. She was beautiful in the easy, unworried way of people who have never been asked to account for themselves, and she laughed readily, and she played the pianoforte well, and she had been raised since girlhood with the expectation that she would do very well for herself in the market. Cecily had nothing against her. She tried to maintain this even position, and mostly succeeded. In February, the Duke began to appear on the same route as Cecily's morning errands, which she had attributed to coincidence until the third occurrence. He walked beside her. He did not offer his arm, because the circumstances did not permit it. But he walked at a distance of perhaps 18 inches, which in the cold February air felt, to a body calibrated to notice such things, as warm as proximity to a fire. He said once, in the pause between one conversational subject and the next, "You keep your counsel unusually well." She said, "I have had practice." He said, "I know." She did not know what that meant. But her hand, resting at her side in its white glove, closed briefly around the place where the garnet pin was set at her collar. It was during one of these February mornings that she saw the signet ring for the first time. His coat was open at the breast against the cold. And when he reached for his watch chain, the coat parted further, and she saw the shape of something in his breast pocket. A ridge of metal under the fabric. She thought at first it was a small case, or a folded letter. And then, as he adjusted his coat, it shifted and caught the light at its edge, and she understood that it was a ring, gold, worn there, rather than on his hand. She did not ask. He did not offer. They walked on. She found out about Catherine from his steward's wife, who was a sensible woman named Mrs. Elwood, who had been at Muirfield Hall for 11 years, and who mentioned, in conversation at a tea to which Lady Halford was invited that spring, that the house had been very quiet since the late Duchess's passing. She said it the way one says a permanent fact about a landscape, matter-of-factly, as something the listener already knows, not knowing that this listener did not. Cecily said carefully, "It has been 3 years, I think." Mrs. Elwood said, 3 years in March. It was very sudden. The child was lost as well. She folded her hands on the tea table. His Grace was not able to get to her in time. He does not speak of it. He did not speak of it. But in April, on the last of their shared walks before the season shifted and made the mornings publicly legible in a way that required them to cease, he said, without looking at her, "The gallery at the house, the West End." She said nothing, only waited. He said, "There is a portrait there that I am not yet able to look at straight." She said, "I saw the back of it." "Then you know something about the nature of the room." "A little," she said. They walked another half a block. He said, "Her name was Catherine. She was kind, and she was not afraid of much, which I found, in retrospect, more courageous than I credited at the time." Cecily said, "I think it is often the quality we fail to credit until afterward." He looked at her, briefly, sideways. It was not the look of a man who is surprised. It was the look of a man who has found, in a sentence, the thing he has been searching for, without knowing the shape of what he sought. The season deepened toward summer, and something shifted in Lady Constance's management of the arrangement she had been quietly building. The Whitmore family was to be present at the Ashmore summer party at Muirfield Hall in June, along with 30 other guests. Lady Constance had spoken, at dinner at Lord Hartley's table, of an engagement announcement expected at the summer party, and she had said it with the quiet authority of a woman announcing a thing already decided rather than a thing still in discussion. If you have stayed this far, you know something already of how precisely Lady Constance read the calendar. Leave a thought below about whether you saw this particular turn coming. In May, Lady Constance came to call on Lady Halford on a Tuesday afternoon. Cecily was in the adjoining room with the door ajar, reading aloud from a volume of sermons that Lady Halford had requested, and promptly fallen asleep over. She heard Lady Constance's voice before she heard her knock. "The girl," Lady Constance said, "is making herself inconvenient." Lady Halford, startled awake, said, "What girl?" "Your companion, Cecily Vane." Cecily set down the volume without a sound. "She is perfectly adequate," Lady Halford said, mildly confused. "She is more than adequate, which is precisely the problem," Lady Constance said. "Edward has taken a particular notice of her, and it is not the kind of particular notice that leads anywhere proper. The Whitmore connection has been under discussion for 2 years, Lady Halford. It is good for Edward and good for the family. I cannot afford to have it undermined by an attachment to someone entirely without position." Lady Halford was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is it you wish me to do?" "Send her to your niece in Bath," Lady Constance said. "Before June. Before the party." 3 days later, Lady Constance sent a note to Lady Halford's house, addressed to Cecily. It was brief. It asked Cecily to convey to the Duke, at the Averley dinner the following evening, that Lady Constance was unwell and would be unable to attend, and that Lord and Lady Whitmore had graciously offered to sit in her place. It was phrased with the confidence of a woman who expected instructions to be followed without examination. Cecily examined it. She understood. With a clarity that required only a moment and no consultation, that the message was designed to remove Lady Constance's own visible hand from an arrangement of the seating that would place Miss Philippa Whitmore at the Duke's right for the duration of the dinner. Lady Constance was not unwell. The dinner had been organized with Lady Constance present. The Whitmores had not offered anything. They had been maneuvered, and the message, once delivered, would appear to have originated with Lady Halford's household rather than with the Duke's aunt, and would be difficult to publicly contradict without implicating the intermediary. Cecily was the intermediary. She wrote a reply to Lady Constance's note. She said that she would be glad to convey any message Lady Constance wished to send in her own name to His Grace, but that she was not in a position to deliver a communication that misrepresented its origin. She wrote it in the formal register, appropriate to the situation, and she did not qualify it, and she sent it back with the footman who had brought it. The following morning, Lady Constance arrived at Lady Halford's house at 9 o'clock and asked to speak with Cecily privately. She stood in the morning room with her back very straight and her plum-colored pelisse buttoned to the throat, and she said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled and absolutely final, "You have overstepped your station for the last time, Miss Vane. I shall be speaking to Lady Halford before the end of the week. You will be given a character, which I hope your next employer will find adequate, and you will go to Bath with Lady Halford's niece. You will not be at the summer party. You will not be in London after the 1st of June." Cecily said, "I understand, Lady Constance." "I expect you do," Lady Constance said. "The companion," she said with a particular precision, "ought to have understood earlier what her position permitted and what it did not." There were several responses Cecily could have made. She made none of them. She thanked Lady Constance for her time, and she showed her out, and she went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed the garnet pin at her collar between her fingers and did not allow herself to weep, which was a discipline she was, by now, extremely well practiced in. She told herself, in the manner of a woman clearing accounts, the precise facts of her situation. She was 24. She had a character, which Lady Constance had said was adequate, which would serve her at a reduced position with a different employer. She had her wages through June. She had the garnet pin. She had 11 months' worth of savings. She did not have the pair. She had not allowed herself, in the careful accounting she had performed every month since arriving in London, to place the word want beside anything she could not plan for. She attempted that discipline now and found it unusually difficult, which was information of a kind she had no use for. Mrs. Whitmore was heard by 3 distinct people to say, at Lady Averley's card party on the Thursday evening, that it was a great relief that the companion had been sorted, as such girls tended to get ideas. Cecily was not at the card party. She was at Lady Halford's house, reading aloud from the sermons, which Lady Halford had requested again and again fallen asleep over, and she did not hear Mrs. Whitmore's remark until the following morning, when it was reported to her by Lady Halford's maid, who had it from Lady Averley's cook. The sum total of her understanding by the morning of June the 3rd was this: she would leave London before the party. The Duke did not know she was leaving. There was no mechanism by which she could inform him that did not carry the shape of an appeal she would not make. She wrote instead a formal note to his secretary, declining, on Lady Halford's behalf, the invitation to the summer party, on grounds of the old woman's health, which was at least partly true and entirely sufficient. She was in the act of placing this note into an envelope when Lady Halford's footman knocked at the door of the morning room and said that the Duke of Muirfield was at the door and asking whether Miss Vane was available to receive him. The summer party at Muirfield Hall was already underway in the gardens below, when the Duke came through the front entrance and stood for a moment in the hall, which was the posture of a man who has done something with sufficient velocity that the act has slightly outrun the intention. He had read the note from Lady Halford's household, and had been at his solicitor's office when he read it, and had folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, beside the signet ring, and asked to have his horse brought round. The party continued in the garden. The tables were laid under the lindens with white cloth and silver. Lady Constance was at the east end of the terrace with the Whitmores, and Miss Philippa was in pale gold beside her mother, and the assembled guests of the Ashmore household represented the kind of social weight that made a scene in the middle of the terrace a matter of public record that would outlast the summer. He came out through the south door. Cecily was standing at the edge of the terrace, hatted and gloved and holding a very small case, which was the material evidence of the fact that she had already said her goodbyes and received her written character, and had only lingered this long because the hired carriage was delayed. She saw him come through the door, and her chest did something she did not permit to travel to her face. Lady Constance saw him too. She said something to Miss Philippa that was probably a direction to remain in place, and she began to move across the terrace with the measured speed of a woman who intends to arrive before a thing can happen. He was faster. He crossed the terrace in a line so direct that the guests between him and the edge simply stepped aside, and he stopped in front of Cecily and looked at her with those gray eyes, and his face was not composed at all. She had seen it composed for months. She had not imagined precisely what it looked like without that. He said, "You were not going to tell me." She said, "It was not a thing I could tell you." "No," he said, "it was not, and it should not have come to this, and that is my fault, and I am going to correct it now, and I am going to ask for your patience for approximately 30 more seconds." He turned. Lady Constance had arrived at 6 feet and stopped, and the terrace around them had gone largely quiet, and the 30 guests of the Ashmore summer party were attending with the focused interest of people who understand that they are witnessing something. He said in the even voice that carried equally to the terrace's edges, "I wish to present a young woman to those of my guests who have not yet had the pleasure of her acquaintance." He paused. "This is Miss Cecily Vane. She will have my name." 12 words. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Cecily heard, as if from a considerable distance, the sound of Lady Constance's fan snapping open, which was the sound of a woman who requires something to do with her hands. She heard Miss Philippa Whitmore say, in a voice of genuine surprise rather than affront, "Oh." She heard the linden leaves move in the mild June wind. Then the nearest guests began to murmur, which was the particular murmur of recognition, and several people moved toward them, and Lord Hartley, who was standing near the table, raised his glass. She looked at the Duke. He was looking at her with the directness he had never permitted himself in 8 months of drawing rooms and January walks, and the particular discipline of a man who had kept his hand from a thing he wanted. "I am aware," he said quietly, so that it was between them, and not the terrace, "that this is abrupt." "It is a little abrupt," she said. "I have been deliberate for several months," he said, "and I am told the result was difficult to distinguish from inaction. I have corrected for that." She said, "Your aunt." "My aunt?" he said. is approximately 8 feet away and entirely capable of reaching a correct conclusion without assistance. She did not look at Lady Constance. She looked at him, at the faint crease between his brows, at the firm mouth with its left corner set slightly lower than the right, at the man who had carried a ring in his breast pocket for 3 years and had not been able to look at a portrait, and who had found a garnet earring on the floor of his library and had begun, from that morning forward, to account for things differently. She said, yes. It was not quite a formal acceptance, and they were both aware of this, but it was an answer that covered the ground entirely, and he nodded, and something in his face released. The carriage that had been delayed arrived at the front of the house at that moment, which was an inconvenient coincidence. It was easy to find amusing, and she did, a small private amusement, and he looked at her face when she had it, and something in his own expression did a thing she could not entirely name. The Ashmore summer guests went on making their murmur of recognition and approval. Lady Constance stood at the edge of it, with her fan open and her thin mouth held in the careful composure of a woman who is revising the plan without letting the revision show. And Lord Hartley went on holding his glass aloft, and the Lindens went on breathing in the June air, and she stood at the edge of the Mirrorfield terrace and held the shape of the last 8 months in her mind for one more moment, and let them be over. The summer was long and settled. Lady Halford received the news with a dry satisfaction that Cecily had not expected, and that was, in fact, the warmest thing the old woman had produced in 8 months of companionship. She said, "He is the kind of man who takes a long time to see what is directly in front of him and then acts as though there was never any delay." And she returned to her sermons. And that was the extent of the celebration, which suited Cecily exactly. The announcement in the Gazette appeared on a Thursday in August. That evening, in the sitting room of Lady Halford's house, where Cecily still resided pending the wedding in the autumn, the Duke came to call, which was now a permissible thing. And he sat across from her in the chair by the window, with the evening light making the room amber and still. He brought the garnet earring, not the one she had reclaimed from him in Lady Halford's drawing room, the one from Hanover Street. She had not told him the name of the shop. She had told him the outstanding sum once, and said she did not require assistance, and he had heard the first part and set the second aside. He had found the broker and paid the full redemption price, and recovered the earring before the winter had fully passed. He had been holding it in his breast pocket alongside the signet ring for 6 months. He placed it on the arm of the chair beside her without ceremony, the garnet catching the amber light, and she reached for it, and he said, "May I?" And she was still, and he took both garnets from the arm of the chair and leaned forward and set one at her right ear and one at her left, the hook settling into the old holes that had never quite closed. She felt the weight of them, both together, balanced and complete, for the first time in 2 years. They were not heavy pieces. 2 is not 1, and the difference was immense. She did not have words adequate to that particular moment. She found she did not need them. He looked at her in the amber room with his gray eyes and the faint crease between his brows, and the face of a man who has been accounting for things more carefully these past months, and she thought of a library at midnight with a cold fireplace, and the particular quality of being alone in a room for 5 minutes and breathing, and she thought of how much can travel between 2 people in a year of January walks, and a ring kept in a breast pocket, and a question asked across a table in a morning room. She reached up and touched the right earring, briefly, with 1 finger. Then she let her hand fall. "My mother would have approved," she said. He said, "I hope she would have found my conduct sufficient." "Eventually," Cecily said. There was one moment, very brief, where the left corner of his mouth did something that might, by the most generous definition, have been called a smile. She would think of that expression, in the year that followed, as the finest thing she had seen in all her time in London. She would not say so aloud, because she was not given to that kind of declaration, and he would not have believed it in any case, and it would not have required saying. By Christmas, he had turned the portrait in the West Gallery. It faced the room. He had looked at it for a long time on a December afternoon while snow fell on the Muirfield grounds, and Cecily had stood beside him without speaking. And after a while he had taken the signet ring from his breast pocket and placed it on the small finger of his right hand, where it sat in the old groove it had worn across 10 years of use before he had put it away. The garnets were at her ears. The pear was whole. The fire in the gallery needed tending, and she went to see to it. And when she turned back, he was still looking at the portrait. But the quality of the looking had changed, as if a long-held breath had quietly been let go, and the room had settled around it, and outside the snow went on falling, and the house held all of them together in the particular warmth of things that are no longer withheld. Thank you for staying until the end. If the garnets and all they carried moved you, leave a word about it in the comments, and we will have more stories here for you soon.